Morning, colleagues. I'm not sure whether you can see me and hear me. This is Rob from CRA. If you can hear me, write something in the chat box or otherwise indicate. Okay, thanks, Helen. That's always useful to know. I'm really just here to do the introductions and welcomes. In that context, really to express thanks to Lorraine from Dundee, who's bringing together a really quite heady mix, I guess, in the current context of a focus around learning gain, which is very much a topic that's of interest in the sector right now. A range of approaches being developed. And also clearly employability, which is writ large on the Wordle that's on the screen on Lorraine's slides. What we're going to do is, I'm going to do in a minute, is to hand over to her. She's going to offer her presentation, and as that goes along, a couple of things really, which are housekeeping related. One is Kath, my colleague Kath Houston, who's in the office, has control of the system, and so she's going to make sure we're all on mute in terms of our audio connections, and the reason for that is very simple, but it's amazing how much interference you get. We can hear everybody typing everything, we can hear people going past, we can hear people in other buildings almost speaking. It's so sensitive, the technology. But there will be time towards the end when three things will happen, I hope. One is Lorraine's webcam will show us her in the north of the UK, and the other is that people will then be unmuted and we can do some discussion and questions. Having said that, some people have discovered already, and please, if you haven't discovered it, just note that it's there in the in what is on my screen on the right hand side. There's a chat facility just below the attendees which says who's here, and I'd encourage you as we're going along just to jot down thoughts and questions and ideas in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on that, and we'll use that as part of our discussion focus towards the end, and that will give us at least some starting points that people might want to talk a little about. The other thing to say is that the session is being recorded, and Lorraine's presentation and the recording will both be available to people who attended the event, and knowing the speed at which Kath works, I would think within the next 24 hours. So with that, and without more ado, you're very welcome, and I'll hand over to Lorraine, and I'm looking forward very much to how the hour develops. Thanks for that, thanks for joining us. Talk to you all a little bit later.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining in this webinar. My name is Lorraine Anderson. I work at the University of Dundee, where I'm one of two assistant directors in student services, but my main role is as head of CASEL, and CASEL is the Centre for the Enhancement of Academic Skills, Teaching, Learning and Employability. And it's the employability bit that got me interested in learning gain, but we'll get to that in a minute. I've got two apologies at the beginning of a presentation, which I know you should never do, and I always tell my, I work with new lecturers, I always say to them, don't start with an apology, but I'm going to. And the first is apologies for the webcam, but as Rob said, it will kick into life later on. We're having problems actually allowing you to see the slides as well as my picture. So I thought I'd stick a photograph up so that you can at least see what I look like. So that's one thing. So an apology, but something that we can remedy. The second apology is my references aren't in the presentation as yet. Again, something I always tell all my undergraduate students, make sure you've got your references up to date as you go along. And of course I was up late last night adding a few more. But I'll make sure that Kath gets those, and you'll get everything as part of the package when she circulates the recording. Okay, so welcome kind of virtually to rather cloudy Dundee today, but I'm very lucky sitting here looking over the Tay from my office and thinking about what we're going to look at today. I've got 4 points there that I think should be the focus of today's webinar, but I really value your thoughts later on the kinds of directions that you might be thinking about with regard to learning gain. I want to look at the idea, the concept of learning gain and what I think it is and it isn't as well, because as Rob has indicated, and I like his phrase, this heady mix, there's a lot out there in the sector just now about learning gain, and I think we might be right to be a little concerned about some of the directions it's taking, and perhaps that it's a little arms and legs growing at the moment, and we need to be absolutely clear what it is that we mean by learning gain and what it is that we're trying to measure. So that's sort of underpinning everything I want to talk about today. I'm also going to give you an outline of our learning gain project here at Dundee. This is something that started about a year or so ago, and I'll tell you a bit about the methodology and findings from phase 1 of our project, and give you an idea about where we're going next with it. I also want to have that good discussion at the end around what learning gain can tell us about student learning, because that surely is the key reason, or it should be the key reason as to why we're talking about learning gain and what we want to get from it. And that's what drove us, myself and colleagues here at Dundee, to have a look at learning gain and this concept in the first place. I have to admit that my interest in learning gain was somewhat serendipitous, in that I was thinking about 2 other things before I actually got to the learning gain idea. And one of those was in Scotland. Those of you, I think there's at least one colleague from the Scottish University, but others may know also about this. The QAA work up here deals with enhancement themes, and we get this idea of a theme every few years that the whole sector looks at, and there's a lot of sharing of good practice and involvement of students. And the current theme is student transitions. And so we're very interested across the sector at looking at how students are transitioning in, through and out of education. And we have a lot of placement opportunities here at Dundee, and I was very interested in thinking about how students transition into placements, get that learning gain experience, and then actually transition back into their studies. So that was a real driver for me to look at this. The other part of the serendipity, if you like, was that the Higher Education Academy put a call out for funding, and a fairly decent amount of funding, which was nice. I know things have changed a little with the landscape there, and funding isn't so easy to come by. But this was almost a bit like a last push, I think, on the funding. And this was the HEA initiative, Strategic Excellence Initiative, which was aimed at Vice-Chancellors and Principals. And speaking with a colleague, we thought, well, could we put these 2 things together? Could we have a look at placements and see what students are getting from that in terms of learning gain, and could we apply for some funding? And we did, and we were successful in the funding, which was fantastic, because that allowed us to do things that we couldn't have done ordinarily. And so that's where my focus is coming from. So no, I'm not part of the HEFCE Learning Gain projects, but I'm certainly aware of them. I'm very interested in what they are doing there, and I was speaking to Etta Parks, who is Head of Student Placement at Aston, and certainly very aware of the work she's doing there, and some interesting conversations that we're having. So serendipity had a big part to play here, and we suddenly found that once we'd started on this theme, once we got the money from the HEA, that suddenly there was all of this stuff about learning gain going on, primarily in the English sector. I think is a much higher profile there than it does north of the border. But as you'll be aware, this concept of learning gain has significant currency at the moment, largely driven by the various papers emanating from the government, and thinking about the UK government and thinking about TEF. And also some other papers as a bit of a backdrop, and I'd like to look at those in a little bit more detail in a minute, but I'll just run through these three sort of, in my eyes, the current areas of work looking at learning gain. So we've got two studies. We've got Graham Gibbs's work, Dimensions of Quality report that he completed for the HEA in 2010. So that's 6 years ago, getting on for maybe almost 7 years ago now, but a really interesting report where he talks a lot about educational gain rather than learning gain specifically. So terminology, I think, is actually quite important to this debate, and how we phrase what it is that we're looking at, how we conceptualize it. So there's Gibbs's work, and then there's also the American study a year later, or published a year later, Academically Adrift, which looked at concerns over academic achievement in the US with their college students. And again, that's thinking about educational gain. So we'll look at those in a little bit more detail in a minute. The other driver for me was, at that point, the UK government's Green Paper, the 2015 paper, which refers to student outcomes and learning gain, that phrase again, as key to developing an understanding of the complexity and breadth of teaching quality and excellence, and what those things might start to look like within a teaching excellence framework. And obviously time has progressed a little bit, and we have a white paper now, the government response, and things continue to move, but learning gain is certainly a focus of their work there. So the link there between learning gain, value in terms of education. And the third one was the Hefke-Rand report, which again 2015, a very thorough report exploring a range of issues in relation to learning gain and the connection there with the Hefke funded projects. I'm going to an event actually next month, the Future of Learning Gain in the Higher Education Landscape, which is being held on the 13th of December, and looking forward to hearing about the outcomes of a number of the Hefke funded projects there. We're certainly getting a lot of information, I'll say that much. There's a huge amount of interest in this area, and we're getting a lot of data that we'll be able to do something with. But that's why I think that it's even more important at this moment that we're absolutely clear, or as clear as we can be at this stage, what we want to do with it, and why, and what we're actually learning from this. Coming back to Gibbs again, and thinking about the terminology, Gibbs notes that, and quoting from him here, that what best predicts educational gain is measures of educational process. In other words, what institutions do with their resources to make the most of the students they have, with a small range of pedagogical practices that engender student engagement. So he's looking at the idea of predicting, estimating, thinking about educational gain in terms of the process of working with the students. So it's not just about the, as some people, perhaps that fabled man in the street, if you were to ask what's a good measure of learning gain, they would say, well, how well a student does in their assessment at university or their degree classification. Graham Gibbs is thinking a bit more there about what it is that we do with the students. It's sort of that value added element that we can add to their learning that helps them to develop in terms of their educational gain, their learning gain. And that, I suppose, resonates very clearly with me in terms of work placements, because for me they are a real value-added opportunity for students. He goes on to say, and I'm quoting again here, that because educational performance is predicted by the entry standards of students, to compare institutional performance in a valid way, it is necessary to measure educational gain. The difference between performance on a particular measure before and after the student's experience of higher education. So we're getting a little bit more into it here, and two things coming out here, because Graham Gibbs is starting to talk about institutional performance. So what is it we're actually looking at here in terms of learning gain? Is it individuals' learning gain? Is it institutional learning gain? Institutional educational gain? I think we have to be quite clear about the language. And then he's thinking about the ways in which that can be measured. So a difference between performance on a particular measure before and after the student's experience of higher education. So there's something there about measuring the student, perhaps their experience, their ability, their capability in certain areas, and they enter university and when they leave. Now for me, I certainly would hope that everyone that has an educational experience in university would come out a different person, would have gained something in way of their learning. You'll see at the bottom the strapline for the University of Dundee is about transforming lives, and certainly we would want to focus on a transformational learning experience for our students. But sometimes people are, and often in fact, people are measuring something a little harder than that transformational experience, because that can be very difficult to grasp. And that's where we get into thinking about the Academically Adrift report. And this was the work done in the US by Aram and Roxa, where they administered the CLA, Collegiate Learning Assessment Test, to a group of students, a fairly significant group. They were eventually able to do some analysis of more than 2,300 undergraduates at 24 institutions across the US. And they administered the test, the CLA, in semester 1 when the students began their studies, and also at the end of their second year. So they're looking at 2 years of college study. Now what came out of that was that 45% of those undergraduates demonstrated no significant improvement in a range of skills that we would think were pretty vital actually in terms of university experience: critical thinking, complex reasoning and writing. Now that kind of put the cat amongst the pigeons, that report, although I have to say that since then there's been one or two, several papers who have come back to say, well, actually maybe there's something there in terms of how the study was carried out, or how the group that they looked at, or part of the academic debate around it. So although it created a bit of a stir, I think that it shouldn't be taken as the be-all end-all, but just something else to put into the mix. And as Rob has said there, those kinds of skills are absolutely key to employability. Those are the kinds of things that we would hope our students were developing in terms of their, what we might call graduate attributes. Now, graduate attributes is a phrase that has perhaps gone out of fashion a little bit, although I see it coming back. I'm not wanting to give my own self a plug, but we do have an edited collection coming out with Taylor and Francis next year, looking at graduate attributes, which really does seem to be coming back into way of thinking again. But we'll talk about that later. So anyway, we've got Gibbs, we've got Academically Adrift as a background, we've got the work done by Hefke. Now, if we're thinking about what is learning gain, this is a Hefke definition. It's a little bit open initially, which is perhaps right at this stage, that learning gain can be defined and understood in a number of ways. I think that's fine, but then you have to focus in a bit. And they go on to say that broadly it's an attempt to measure the improvement in knowledge, skills, work readiness, there's that employability bit again, and personal development, that's a bit that's a bit harder to pin down, made by students during their time spent in higher education. Now, it was that idea of improvement, of the gap, the gain that could be made, that got us thinking about our project, and we looked at the 5 methodologies that Hefke have identified as good, valid, appropriate ways to measure learning gain. You talk about standardized tests to measure the skills that students acquire, so that's very similar to the CLA. They talk about grades to measure the progress that students are making, looking at grades from their assessment at different points in time. They talk about self-reporting surveys. This is more about student perception and student belief, where students get to think about and reflect on the extent to which they've developed knowledge or skills, or I would add to that personal attributes. And it was a self-reporting study that we were interested in, but I'll just finish with the other 2 Hefke 5 methodologies. So they also mention other qualitative methods, so encouraging students to reflect on their learning, perhaps through blogs or reflective journals, and thinking about skills and skills gaps that they have. And then a mixed method approach, looking at ways of tracking improvement in performance over time. So we'll come back to that in a minute in terms of what we did at Dundee and where we might go forward. But let me tell you a bit about our Dundee project. So this is Learn and Gain at Dundee, and the overall aim was to build on the work that we already do around graduate employability and helping students to develop in those areas. And we wanted to use the concept of the distance travelled. This is something that comes out of the RAND report. And in this case, it was a distance travelled by students during their placements and by capturing and exploring associated learning gain. So we know, and I would imagine that we're all aware anecdotally, that placements are a good thing, but we wanted to have, to develop a way of measuring that and to give us a benchmark, if you like. However, a lot of the other things came out of it that we'll get to later, which I was not perhaps surprised, but really welcomed seeing. And actually the things that the students were saying about what they learned during their placements, the learning gain that they had actually secured during the placement activity, was a lot more than just the skills base that perhaps we might have thought would be in evidence. So let's just have a look at what we did very quickly with the project. So what we were doing there was trying to get to the realities of the work-based learning experience, trying to get the students to actually surface what it is they were engaging with and what it was they were learning. We wanted to use those findings, and we still want to use those findings, to inform ongoing curriculum development, policy and guidelines. As I say, we have a lot of placement activity at the university. Some of that's vocational. We are quite a professional university, so we have medicine, nursing, law, accountancy, social work, etc. But we also have a very well-developed career service in terms of the placements that they offer, and also through credit-bearing careers modules. So we have a lot of students taking internships and placements through their studies on the careers modules, and we have colleagues in the humanities and arts and social sciences who are also starting to explore placements. So we were very keen to build up more information and learning for ourselves about the kind of guidelines that would be useful for students, to update our placement policy, and also, and this is something that I would really welcome your thoughts on, is how we can capitalise on that learning when the students are out on placement. How can we help them capitalise on that when they get back into their studies, to capitalise on that learning gain and to help other students who perhaps don't have the opportunity to take a placement? How can we feed that into the curriculum? So we wanted to think then about what we could do to help the students get the best placement experience and to enhance that employability of our graduates, which is always there as a key aspect of what we do. So the actual project, which came to an end earlier this year, just before the summer, we used a fairly simple approach in that we developed a pre- and post-placement questionnaire. So that was giving us the 2 points for the distance travelled. So it was a questionnaire implemented before the students went on to placement, and another one when they came back. And when they came back from placement, the questionnaire was a little broader and had, in terms of having more open questions, more free text responses. The questions, which I'll show you in a minute, were based on the HEA's undergraduate UKS survey, so the UK engagement survey for students. We had a good look at that, and we drew some questions based on that survey. And then we looked around to see what would be useful groups to pilot our questionnaire with. So we looked at 4 student groups. And I guess the first group, the school tutoring programme, is where we actually piloted the questionnaire. And then we went on to run the project proper, if you like, with the other 3 groups. And that was a business management internship module, the internship module, and the learning for life module. Let me tell you about two of those that you might be wondering what are they. The school tutoring programme is open to all undergraduates from any discipline who think they might like to go into teaching, and they get an opportunity to go and act as a tutor in school as a placement. So it doesn't matter what their discipline area is, they have an opportunity to get a taster, if you like. And the Learning for Life module is almost the other way around, in that these are students who are training to be teachers. It's a teacher education programme, but what they're encouraged to do is, as well as having their programme placements in school, they're encouraged in this module to look more widely and to think about taking a placement in a completely different area, and that could be in the UK or it could be overseas. And we had students who went to work with charities or went to work with completely different kinds of businesses, just to almost test themselves in some ways to see, actually, is it teaching I really want to do, or is it something different? Or can I actually transfer these skills I'm learning as a teacher to something else? And that's been a hugely successful module. So we were keen to do more work with the students from that module, and that's where the focus group came into play. And also we were scoping with the module leader there to look at other aspects of how that module can contribute to our understanding about placement learning. So we had our questionnaires, we had our student groups, and we were really excited to get going with that. What questions did we ask them? We looked at 5 questions, and these are very much, the majority of them, I suppose you would say, are skills-based questions, and that we wanted to get the students to rate their ability in terms of thinking critically and analytically, and also in being able to write clearly and effectively, and to work effectively with others. So these are pretty standard employability attributes, if you like. So we wanted students to be able to tell us, you know, how well do you think you can interrogate a problem rather than just describing it? Or how can you actually communicate your thoughts to others? Or how well can you work as part of a team? So they were rating their ability to do that before and after the placement. There were 2 other questions that we thought were really important to include there, and one was about understanding people from backgrounds different to your own, and the other was about exploring complex real-world problems. Rob's wondering whether we asked for evidence to support their ratings, and that's a very good question. We didn't, Rob, actually. This really was based on their own perception. I'd be interested in what you think would be useful evidence, unless that was just falling back then on assessments perhaps that they've done, or to give more of a, I suppose we could have had a chat with them, or we could have got them to write a little piece about themselves, but no, we didn't. But that's an interesting thing to think about, because obviously it's helpful for the students to reflect on that themselves, to try and get deeper into it. What did we find from phase 1? Well, you may be unsurprised that, and this is statistically significant, and this is perhaps the most important bit, and we brought a colleague in who works with stats, that's not my area, but we were able to demonstrate that there was a statistically significant increase in students' perceptions of their skills in relation to all of those areas. The one, interestingly, that was slightly weaker in terms of statistical significance was the relating to others from diverse backgrounds. And that perhaps gives a little hint about things that would need to be included in the curriculum that maybe aren't there. We're very keen to put things in terms of skills development, writing, team working. But this relating to others from diverse backgrounds was something that they found more of a challenge. And I suppose perhaps Dundee and maybe a lot of the Scottish universities, certainly on the East Coast, are perhaps not as ethnically diverse as some other institutions, and perhaps even the workplace environments as well. Although we did ask students to think about the range of diversity. So that could be gender or age related as well as ethnicity, but that was the one that they felt they hadn't improved in as much. But let's hear a little bit from the students rather than hearing from me all the time, because we did work on this project with our Students' Association, and that's DUSA, Dundee University Students' Association, and DUSA TV made a great little video for us. I'm hoping you'll be able to hear it. It's not awfully loud, but there are subtitles, so I'm hoping that that will help you as well. And let me just pull this across, if I can move that, and let's hear from the students.
I was in London with Katie Woodman.
I did my placement at Artman, Scotland's largest art education.
I got involved in the student tutoring program, which I held with the International Communications. Yeah, friends of mine who already work in the industry helped me, and then the career service just over my CV and my cover letter.
I was assistant publisher, assistant editor, journal, and that meant pulling over all of the day-to-day business of the magazine, bringing in revenue as well as commissioning artists.
The most valuable thing I learned was the most what you think it is, and I feel that going on this placement really opened my eyes.
I learned that putting the hard work pays dividends, and that you'll be able to come back at the end of the day and look at the work you've done and feel like.
Know the industry you're applying for, do a lot of research into any questions they might ask. Like online you can find a lot of questions that you can compare with, and then also be very honest in the interview. If you don't know something, just tell them. But instead of just saying, I don't know, trying to figure out a way to solve the problem and show them that you're clever and that you can apply what you've already learned to something that maybe you don't know much about yet. I would say definitely go for the internship module. Simply because it looks good on your CV, of course, but the experience that you gain is absolutely valuable.
Go out and do it. Don't be afraid to meet up people at the highest level. They're always looking for confident people that are going to move the bar and change. Don't be afraid to put your hands up and say, hey, I don't know this. They won't help you, they won't help you.
Okay, so that, as you can see, people have been asking about the link, because I appreciate that the volume is a little bit low on that. But I think that was the students who made that video themselves, which I think is fantastic. They did a really, really good job. The link is here, but we can also obviously send it separately to you in whatever is the easiest way for you to access it, because I think it's well worth sharing and watching again. So after we got the results from the project, and I'll share with you some other things that the students said in a minute, but my colleague and I, Eric Monaghan, and I, who were working on the project, we began to think, what is it we're actually trying to measure here? Is it academic learning? Well, certainly it wasn't anything discipline related, because that wasn't what we were doing. We were looking at the work placement experience. It was academic learning, in inverted commas, I guess, in relation to skills development, because the students did feel that they gained something in terms of their ability to work with others or communicate effectively, etc. But we also thought, is there something else that we're actually trying to measure here? Or turn it the other way around, is there something else that's being presented to us here by the students that we can actually measure or try to measure? And I'm going to skip on. I'll come back to that slide, but I want you to hear a little bit more, see a little bit more about what the students said. Because we got a lot of free text comments back from them. They were great to work with. And these are some examples of the things that students said. So this is Ken, and he did the internship graduate certificate. And when he was talking, the kinds of things that he was talking about that he had learned were things like confidence, being able to operate and interact with other professional colleagues in that authentic professional setting. He felt that he'd got insight into the job that he was working in as his placement. He felt that being able to develop skills like negotiation and compromise and to coordinate areas of his work. And all of these things that were starting to come out, Eric and I were thinking, well, this is real learning gain for the individuals, for the students, being able to operate in that professional context, being able to develop negotiation skills within that authentic setting. Here's another student, this is Hannah, and Hannah is coming from a discipline where we don't see so many placements in operation from history, and history is my background, so I was keen to hear what Hannah got out of her placement, and she was on the school tutoring programme that I mentioned earlier. So Hannah was thinking again about the skills that she'd developed by working in this professional context, so the professionalism aspect coming through very strongly. Felt that she developed confidence and independence. She's perhaps talking a little bit more about those more anticipated skills, the employability and the communication skills. But the underpinning confidence and independence are these very personal graduate attributes which are quite difficult to embed within curriculum, within academic learning. Christina gives us another view on this. She was quite straight talking. She was saying, you know, the most important thing that she learned from her experience, she was an intern relation to her economic studies, was about kill the fear, you know, get over it, get out there, do it. And I've taken the liberty of looking carefully through what she said and pulling out some of the things that I feel that Christina is telling us about what she's learned, about her developing confidence, assertiveness, self-belief, resilience, motivation, but how aspirational this kind of opportunity can be. And these phrases about self-belief, resilience, developing confidence, these chime very well with the work that we're doing through the student transitions studies, the enhancement theme work, and trying to help students to develop self-belief, to develop resilience, to give them those kinds of life skills, perhaps, for want of a better phrase, to help them in the future. So this is what Eric and I started to think. Maybe this is the learning gain that the students are really getting from the workplace situation. Let me just pop back a minute to that slide, where we started to reflect on what can we actually measure. So I suppose we're starting to think now a bit more generally about the concept of learning gain and what it is that we're actually measuring. Learning gain, educational gain, personal experience, graduate attributes, what is it? As I mentioned earlier, you know, if we're trying to measure something, yes, we can look at degree classifications, although as Graham Gibbs says in his Dimensions of Quality report, it's, you know, you get certain kinds of students going to a certain university, and there is an element of being able to predict what it is that students will come out with. There's also assessments. We could use assessments. We could look at student assessments in Year 1, Year 2, Year 3, and for the Scottish context in Year 4, and look at learning gain over the years in relation to their academic development. And Graham Gibbs also notes that there's certainly interesting work that could be done here. However, he also gives us the caveat that we're all perhaps aware of about grade inflation as well, and all of the other issues around assessment. I think learning gain is a useful concept, but it certainly is for me very much a relative concept. It's very relative to the individual experience. I think a lot of it has to come from the student themselves through the idea of giving them clear tools and ways of helping them, and perhaps Rob's right, it's something I need to go and think about there, about evidence and backing up their views on where they are when they're rating themselves, but to help them to really self-evaluate in terms of where they are at the beginning of their studies or the beginning of a work placement or an internship or whatever part of the project is, and then to look again at the end. And that in itself will be very much relative to that student learning gain. It's the progress they are making as an individual. And I guess that's what's making me slightly anxious when I hear people talking about institutional learning gain and looking at learning gain across the piece rather than with individuals. But I'm still throwing that one around in my mind and to thinking about that, so I'd be keen to hear what people feel about that. But certainly I think that learning gain as a transformation is really important. I mean, some of the things that the students from the work placements were coming back and telling us in their free text comments, you know, they were saying that this has been such an eye-opener for me, you know, and how do you put that into an academic curriculum, you know, as an intended learning outcome? You will have your eyes opened, you know. It's not something you're going to get within the academic curriculum, perhaps. It's something you're going to get by giving the students a value-added, authentic learning opportunity in the workplace where real learning gain, real transformational learning can take place. But there are challenges around that too, of course. We certainly at Dundee are moving towards providing as many students as we can with placement opportunities. I know that other universities, colleagues at Aston certainly are aiming for 100% placement opportunities for their students, but that's not always possible. Certainly for us here, where our university is, we don't have as big an economic hinterland, perhaps, in terms of sourcing placement. And there are always going to be students who, because of their personal situation, whether it's caring responsibilities or perhaps a less able student or because of ill health, are unable to take part in placements. Bob's raised the question there about how far risk-taking can be built into learning outcomes in the curriculum. And I think that's an interesting idea. I think perhaps we do play it a little bit too safe, maybe. There are, of course, always the unintended learning outcomes, and I would always want students to be exploring those at the end of a period of study. Not just have you gained the intended learning outcomes, but what else have you developed? What was the unintended learning outcome? And perhaps that's the learning gain. Perhaps that's the bit, and that's what I'm just making a little note of there for myself, because that's a nice thought there, Rob. As Graham Gibbs says, you know, and again quoting there about students bringing more to higher education than just their scores, just their grades from the previous assessment, that they have all of these things: cultural capital, aspiration, self-confidence or lack of perhaps, motivation, that can influence their performance and interact with the teaching. So I think it is too simplistic to look at learning gain in relation to assessment or degree classification. It has to be much more than that, I would argue. But right, we're almost there. I think I've just got one more slide, which was my kind of round-up thoughts about what student voice tells us. What has this project told me? Authentic context such as work placements, you know, how valuable they are, and also thinking about, you know, how measurable are these very relative personal graduate attribute developments. Maybe it's just measurable on an individual level, and perhaps that's the most important thing. We've got the student perception about the skills development, and that's where Rob's earlier point comes in. Is this genuine learning gain? It's based on student perception. Again, I think relative to the student, yes, I think that is genuine. And as I mentioned earlier, this idea about how we can ensure that students continue to capitalise on this learning when they're back in the university. How can we embed more authentic learning opportunities in the curriculum? What next for learning gain? I think it's really exciting, the work that's going on in the sector. We have several things going on here in the university, one of which is looking at a specific group of students. These are our associate students who are currently undertaking their first year of study in a further education college and then transitioning into second year at university. And we're going to do some work with them in terms of their perceived learning gain through a transition course that we have for them called Step Up. So we're going to do some more work with the students. We're going to engage with our colleagues who are looking at these things south of the border, and we're going to keep thinking about conceptions of learning gain and what that can mean for us and our students. And I would really like to hear from others and to get some questions. So what I'm going to do is open up my laptop, which has the camera in, so the screen will disappear now with the slides, and hopefully you'll see me. You never know. Let me try.
Yes, we can see you, Lorraine. Rob, it's there's a bit of light bounce perhaps off and outside. Perhaps you've got real sunshine in there.
Ah, it's very rare, but we have got it. Well, is that better?
That's fantastic, thank you. I mean, colleagues, what we'll do in a minute is unmute the microphones of each and every one of you so we can have a conversation. But do bear in mind, if you're getting background noise, you can just mute yourselves as we go along. Some, I mean, really very helpful frames there for me, I think, notably the notion of, you know, is learning gain about the institution? Is it about demonstrating to someone else what a great job you're doing? And how does that coexist with that focus on the individual, Lorraine, that you were picking up in terms of almost enhancement of the capabilities and awareness and skills of that person? And Ruth's just got a comment in the chat there right at the end about the notion of innovation in the curriculum and how that's going to impact on and relate to the TEF, which might facilitate innovation, but might just facilitate a different kind of paradigm. So I'll shut up and we'll see either with people writing stuff in the chat, which is fine, and in fact Ruth asked the question there just a bit further down, which is the issue of learning gain and how is that going to coexist with TEF if it is. So I'll shut up and we'll get started on stuff in the chat. Maybe start with that one, Lorraine.
Yep.
And other people might want to join in as we go, either in the chat or by speaking through the microphone. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Hi, Ruth. Thank you for that question. I think learning gain measures could supplement TEF measures. I think that would be a very valuable thing to have, because for me it would put much more emphasis on the student, that it would be a much more student-centred approach rather than focusing on the larger institution. But having said that, I'm not sure how it would be implemented in practice, and it may be that we're some time away from understanding how that could work, because as you've also mentioned earlier, Ruth, several of the HEFCE projects are longitudinal, so we don't actually have the feedback, the evaluation yet from what the results are telling us about that. But I think if we were to have some kind of focus on learning gain as a student-centred way of measuring learning, I think that would be a really exciting thing to have with the TEF.
Thanks, Lorraine. Helen's just raising a point about terminology that I think is really worth spending a minute or two on, because it is around some long-standing debates, but also very much up to date in terms of the terminology we use to recognise the value of off-campus learning, which we're talking about, but also without suggesting to colleagues that what they're doing is in any way less valuable. I guess that's what you're saying, Ellen. If you're not, write something else in the chat and correct me. Thanks.
Yes, that's a very interesting point, Helen, actually, that we do need to be careful about using real-world and authentic context to describe learning gained through placements, as it might emphasise a divide between learning within and outside the academy. I would hope that there isn't too much of a divide. I think, and I suppose it depends where your institution is with this in terms of their thinking. We certainly have this enormous push on employability here. And we would see that everything that we're doing is involving employability in some respect. Although I do know that I would say that probably 95% of colleagues are on board with that, but there are some disciplinary areas where they still find that challenging to the discipline of what they're doing in terms of their academic learning. And it may be that you're right, we need more of an understanding between the two areas and what can be gained from that. And I have to say sometimes, again, and as I said before, history is my background, so I can feel a little bit challenged as well about the employability driver, but it's something that I do a lot with now, and I think my eyes have really been opened, and we talked before about how do you embed that as an intended learning outcome in the curriculum. But my eyes have really been open to the value of work placement learning opportunities. But that's why I'm so keen not to fetishize that, perhaps, not to have it so exclusive that we must be able to somehow capture that learning gain and embed it into the curriculum. So we need to think more widely, perhaps as, let's use historians again as an example. How can we help our colleagues who are historians to think about embedding authentic opportunities into the curriculum? If they're not able to get their students out on relevant work placements, what other things can we put into the curriculum that could mirror or echo those placement opportunities? And I think that would be a really interesting discussion to have at the discipline level, actually.
I'm also reminded, sorry, this is Rob, that of the work of the National Coordination Team for Employability more than a decade ago, which basically argued that the kind of capabilities employers outside of academic settings seek are very similar to the kind of capabilities that academics in their graduate students and PhD students and so on. So in lots of ways there's some connections that we could forge there in terms of the person specification we're actually all looking for. Ruth's raised an interesting question about, might there be some opportunities to influence TEF Year 4? My God, we're only in TEF Year 1, I think. So it's a question of how those timeframes fit together. I don't know the answer to that. Other people around the context will be maybe able to answer that. But obviously Jessica doing some work and Ruth's flagged that up. Ruth, I don't know whether you can speak to us, but if you can speak to us, do you want to say anything about the work?
Yeah, I can try. Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you, Ruth.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Rob. Well, at the moment, JISC is running a consultation that's sort of coming to a soft end at the end of this week around looking at how different data sources to those in the TEF at the moment could be used to enhance the teaching. And so there's various ways to engage in this work, and I can add a link into our blog where you can add comments in a second. But basically we ran a webinar yesterday, a joint one with ALT, and that question about employability came up, and I'm just finishing off a blog about that webinar, so I can circulate that as well, or perhaps Rob could. Because, as I said, we've sort of come up with the idea of there are scary data monsters out there, and we asked what should we explore and what should we avoid, and a very strong message came back from mostly the university people saying they were concerned about employability in the curriculum, but the college people that were there said, well, that's our sort of daily bread and butter, so we do that already. So I think there's a sectoral difference here, and it might be cultural according to your institution's mission as well, as to whether subject areas see their need to incorporate employability, soft skills in the curriculum. On a personal note, my daughter is in her third year at Southampton University, and they have got a very active part in her, she's reading history, and they seem to be very active in their department trying to encourage students to do employability. But it is quite interesting to hear it from the students' point of view on what they see as important. And what I'm getting from her and her friends is they realise it's important, but they're quite strategic in how they engage with what institutions think of employability and how to enhance it. Mm-hmm. And when students choose to engage in that sort of thing compared to their sort of normal study, mm-hmm. So how students see it as being embedded or not can sometimes differ, I think, to how institutions feel they are embedding it. So interested to follow up on the videos on the students' perception. Mm-hmm. Those are really useful, I think, Lorraine. Yeah. So I don't know if others have got any other comments about how your institutions view, in inverted commas, employability, because from what it sounds like with the TEF is that the government are very focused on outcomes, student outcomes, and their data is very much outcomes focused, and so there, I believe that there's an opportunity, and the government do seem to be listening and hefty about how to add supplementary data to the TEF. So I think that's where we have potentially got a small window of opportunity, but very interested to hear what people on the ground think.
Yes, thank you for that, Ruth. I thought that was really useful to bring that up because I wasn't aware of that. But if there are ways that we can flag up something that, as you say, avoids it just being the data monster, and we really get that student voice in there and be much more student-centred, I think that would be great.
John's raised a point about that, about the developing metrics for self-evaluation. And I guess there's an issue about how we can present that, not least in the context of the contextual statement that institutions are asked to submit alongside their, or with reference to the TEF metrics. And clearly that's got to be institutionally important, but I guess, Lorraine, what you're drawing our attention to in this context is, at the end of the day, this is about the individual development of students and their capacity to progress their careers as a result of participating in these kinds of opportunities and recognising what they've got out of them.
Yes, and I suppose there's more work to be done there to look across cohorts. You could look at cohorts in terms of learning game, those who had done work placements, those who hadn't. What are the ways within the curriculum that we can help students to build confidence and self-resilience and other things that they may have got from the work placement. So I think there are other ways that we can put the measures into place. But for me, it's always very much student-centred, very relative concept that for the individual, this is the learning game that they have got. And I think that is perhaps the way to engage students as well. It's not just about all of your students on the course, that's nice, but this is about you and thinking about your own learning game and how you can develop an individual and take ownership of that development.
Yes, sorry, I'm nodding vigorously here, you can't see me. Colleagues, we're almost out of time. One of the two comments, one, I speak as a lapsed historian as well, so there's a kind of cabal of history here. And cabal is itself a historical reference, of course. The other thing is to recognise this. There is actually someone from Southampton on the call as well. and so they could take a pat on the back. The other thing, though, is this notion of learning gain around enhancement, personal enhancement, as well as institutional reporting. And maybe we've got to fly the flag for that quite significantly in the debates, because there does look to be quite an accounting justification kind of notion, accountability notion in learning gain, and we're kind of flagging it as being something more significant, actually,
Yeah.
for students, and also something more central to the higher education experience, it seems to me, as opposed to the demonstrating value for money experience. But I probably would say that, wouldn't I? Any final points before we just finish off? Hazel's raised a Hazel is a Southampton person. Hooray!
Thanks, Hazel.
Okay, I'm conscious that people are going to be disappearing, and Kath's taken over the presentation role. So what we will do, thank you very much, Lorraine, that's been absolutely brilliant.
Thank
But
you.
it's your first webinar, so I hope you've recorded it and you'll be reflecting on it, and the second one will be even better. That's been brilliant. We'll get the recording made available to colleagues, the video link as well, and obviously people will be able to come back to you if there are issues they want to pick up directly. But from now, from the northwest, where it's still not raining, so keep your fingers crossed, I bid you farewell, and until we speak again. Thanks a lot.